Welcome to the Mind Buffs podcast. I am your host, Matt Demoisac, and we are here for another episode with Linz.
Hi.
Our first session that we did on this new episode series was on the power control wheel. And again, just kind of continuing that theme of Lindsay and I talking about power differentials in sport and business and life. And we want to go through this entire theory, not to talk about the extremes of the coaches out there who go to jail because of like the level of like physical and like sexual abuse that they have caused, but to talk about more of the subtle ways, the unintentional ways in which coaches and leaders use some of these tactics because of having a really fixed objective or agenda as a coach. And that is really easy to do because of the kind of power and authority given to coaches that, you know, they feel like they can control everything and it's their job to just have all their players do everything that they say, everything that they teach. So again, it's not that it's coming from a malicious place, but we want to give specific examples of kind of how to avoid the trappings of coercive communication, coercive tactics, coercive coaching. So yeah, just kind of fire away, Linz, and lead us into this wonderful conversation.
The wonderful conversation. So last time we talked about minimizing, denying, and blaming. And today we're going to talk about coercion and isolation. So coercion, another word that you can use is brainwashing. Sometimes that's made it click in my mind a bit more. So those terms are used interchangeably. And it's pretty much threatening someone that you'll do something harmful if they don't follow your rules or do what you want. I put an example of withholding playing time, or more extreme, even access to your sport if you don't do something or you don't perform to a standard that the coach has set.
Totally. Yeah. Even like words like ultimatums, right? It's like, if you don't listen to me, I will take away playing time. If you don't do exactly as I say. And then there's a difference between, you know, an athlete continuing to make the same mistake, which costs the team points and wins, and them not following the team's expectations that like this is the system that we're playing. And, you know, someone just not approaching a particular play in the way that you want, that really at the end of the day does not matter. Like you can still let them be a creative individual on the court or on the ice, but using ice time as a coercive tactic to take away and give, to coerce, I'm not even going to use the word motivate, to coerce the athlete into doing what you want them to do, that's kind of what's happening there a lot of the times.
And there's even extreme examples of having athletes start using performance-enhancing drugs or substances, creating sexual abuse content of them to use if they needed, if you didn't follow through with something that they wanted. So those are more extreme examples of how this coercion could happen.
Yeah. But yeah, even having a conversation around like body image and weight, of coercing athletes to get to a certain weight, whether it's way too low or, you know, I see this a lot with football players of being like, you got to come into camp next year, like 30 more pounds of what? Like, how am I going to be treating my body in that off season to get to that weight that you say I have to be at? That ain't healthy.
No, and that's a whole other conversation we could talk about because, like you said, they don't really teach those players how to gain the 30 pounds. So it's just get there, however you get there.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the primary goal of coercion is to isolate the person and have them eventually align with the coach's beliefs or the leader's beliefs. And they'll use kind of whatever measure, like we gave those examples, to get them to do that. Yeah.
The example you're going to hear me use a lot today, for those of you that have seen Swamp Kings, it's been out for over a year now. It's a sport doc on Netflix, and Alex and I actually did an episode on that series a few months ago, so you can kind of listen to that episode as well. But to me, Urban Meyer is the poster child of a abusive coach who uses coercion and isolation to get what he wants. He basically is a paramilitary coach that expects his players to act as if they're going to war, and uses every type of mindfuckery and scheme and tactic to pit athletes against each other because he thinks that that's a healthy form of competition. And the show was really weird because half the time you think that they're praising him for his success and the tactics he's using, but then when you watch the interviews of like the players, it's this weird cringy, eerie, like they know it's not okay, but they're pretending that it's okay that it's happening. So even like the players who are successful and receiving, the benefits of that type of coercion, which I know you're going to go into, they know it's not okay and they know it's really messed up.
Yeah, and that's another part of the coercion too, is the athletes, like you said, might know what is right and wrong. A whole other topic of then you can't say anything because then you risk your spot on the team or playing time or what have you. But the other part of coercion or brainwashing, if that helps, is eventually getting that athlete to just think that that's the truth and that's what's right. And then they don't think anything else is true. So then they're just going to align with that leader's values, even if they're really wrong.
Totally. And we know this from just the psychological field that we do things to survive, to protect ourselves. And when coercion is being used, again, maliciously or unintentionally, but being on the receiving end of coercive tactics, that is going to trigger the athlete's brain into going into a bit of a fight or flight response to where they're going to use any protective means possible to be okay in that moment or not get kicked off the team, which would feel like an incredible existential threat to like have that taken away. So yeah, players will do strange things because maybe it was from 4 years ago, but some part of their brain thought that this is what coaches expect of me. This is what being a really masculine athlete and stereotypical hockey player looks like to like have success and move forward. And that was shaped in them because of coercive coaching. Sorry, that's how that stuff happens.
Yeah. And then there's the unintentional coercion that you brought up. That's a whole other thing where the coercion is happening and the coach might not even be aware that they're doing it.
Yeah.
Which I think a lot of the time, like you said, it's not necessarily coaches or leaders are trying to be malicious intentionally. A lot of the time people don't know that they're doing this. But the unintentional coercion is something that we see a bit more.
Yeah, and it happens for like innocent reasons, right? The coach thinks that they have a really good idea. They want to be able to have the entire team follow this plan that they've made. But here's the problem. Before they've made their team. So they have this grand vision of how they want the team to play and the systems and rules and regulations and expectations on the team. Yet that coach has no idea what the precise personalities are going to be on that team, which might significantly change whether or not that strategy is going to work or not. And so you see kind of coaches holding on to like one singular type of coaching style or philosophy, and that's not going to work depending on like the personalities of the team. So what ends up happening is there's kind of like this death grip of like, I'm going to make this work no matter what, which then closes the coach off to seeing alternate options to bring out the best in their players.
Yeah, and like that one track mind way of thinking too, of like what you said, this is what I'm going into the season with, but then you get all these different personalities on the team. Different coaches even might have different, or like different coaches on your coaching staff might have different ways of thinking too. But that also then creates a struggle in the ability to build relationships with your players, I find.
Definitely. Like what would you say as a like former college athlete was like the most common type of unintentional, we'll use unintentional, most common unintentional form of coercion that you would experience as an athlete?
Oh my gosh. That's a hard question. Well, based on like the relationship piece that we just said, it was pretty much you had a relationship with coaches or you didn't, I think probably. So you could see that like some people were able to connect with coaches and some weren't. Now, is that going to happen in life? Yeah, you're not going to click with everybody. You're not going to get or know how to be friends with everybody or talk to people, right? But I think when you are with a group of people for 8 months a year, 6 days a week, you should still have some form of relationship or try to, right? I think it was like maybe that lack of effort or that lack of being open to change how you are, how you build relationships with different types of people.
Yeah. And the most common type of coercion that I see is really just playing time, like coaches threatening to kick you off the team or take you out of the game or reduce your minutes or have you just sit on the bench, like kind of in that order of intensity too. But it still feels gross no matter the level of intensity of what's being taken away. And again, it's a misunderstanding from a coach's perspective that a once in a while technique to use fear as a motivator for performance somehow magically works one time, and then it becomes instantly reinforced that this will work 100% of the time. And then they remove every other tool from their toolkit and they just put the one hammer in their pocket and they go to work.
Yeah, it's like when athletes think that they should play angry more often because they'll be angry for one shift and play unreal. But then we always tell our athletes, like, sure, great that happened, but you can't maintain that level of an emotion for 40 minutes or however long your sport is.
Yeah, that's a good example.
So no, lots of examples, of that fear for coercion, or fear to get your players to do something or be a certain way. That's a good example.
Yeah. And I know that you have some more things you want to share about coercion, but just to kind of show like how coercion really easily connects to isolation is that most players will try to resist and push back and fight. Again, whether the coercion is intentional or not, or whether it's even consciously known, because it's definitely subconsciously known, because my nervous system is going to feel really on edge if you're using coercive language or tactics with me. I might not, again, consciously register it, but my body's going to be like, something ain't right. I don't like this feeling at all. And there's going to be a pushback to that discomfort for a while. But then when the athlete realizes that, like, oh no, this is just how it is. And there's nothing I can do about it.
That's interesting you bring that up because I'm curious the difference between female and male sports. And we'd have to look into research on that because I do, and through conversations I've had with people, now this is my opinion and my experience because as a female, we're, I think, less likely to fight back on that coercion because of the fear of the repercussions, of the fear of whatever's being held over your head, playing time, even being on the team, scholarship money, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Well, and in conversations with people who, like from the male athlete perspective, think and say that men are more likely to push back.
I mean, the entire field of sociology would give you 2 thumbs up for that statement. Like, of course, women are shaped to be more, I hate using this word, but it oversimplifies it well, I think, to be more docile.
Yeah.
Just like, no, you shush, you shut your mouth.
Yeah.
You don't say anything.
And if you don't, you're a bitch or you're sassy or whatever.
100%. And whereas as a guy, you're assertive.
Yeah.
I'm laughing because it's so gross, but that I would imagine there would be significant differences in terms of how the boys and girls are handling that coercion.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Now, if you're a coach or a leader, I actually encourage you to pay attention to that because now that we're talking about that, I'm like, that probably happens so much more. Like women are probably so much less likely to fight back. And again, I am generalizing. Not every woman is like this. I know. But it'd be really interesting to actually look into the rates. Yeah. Yeah.
And I just have like story after story flooding in my mind of like working with like female athletes as opposed to male athletes being in that position and like realizing, oh yeah, like it was overwhelmingly so on the women's side of just like shutting up and just like taking it and dealing with it and not pushing back or talking to anyone about it for that, the fear of the social repercussion, because that much is definitely known as well. There's more of a social repercussion when women do not fall in line as opposed to like when men don't fall in line. So yeah, there would be an even stronger fight or flight response as the female athlete when there is that tension.
Well, imagine the like sense of self and like the identity crisis there too, where you maybe are a female who values, let's say, justice, for example, and then you're in a situation where this is happening and everybody else is staying silent, and then you have to be that one to kind of speak up. I have an example.
Yeah.
Our first podcast.
Yeah.
When I spoke up. So uncomfortable.
Yeah.
For me. But I'm also one of, like my example, I'm just saying, I know what's fair and what's not. Did I sit back a lot of my life and let that happen? Yeah. It probably happens on teams all the time. And there's that one person that does know what's wrong or wants to speak up. But then, like you said, I'm not going to because I'm the only one.
Yeah.
I don't want to be singled out.
Totally. Yeah. And then 1 or 2 years later, after you've experienced that hardship, that coach is fired for unknown reasons and pushed out or promoted to another position because they have seen it, but they don't want to like deal with it like in a public way. But it's like you don't get that satisfaction of that public validation that that's what was happening. Like that's how I felt. It's always these things are handled behind closed doors, and then that coach ends up going somewhere else and doing the same thing over and
which
over
is
again.
still a huge systemic problem with this whole conversation that we have of it doesn't get talked about enough, or it gets brushed under the rug.
Yeah. And like, I'm not going to brush this one under the rug. I'm not going to name names, but like the soccer community in Edmonton, I'll just speak to Edmonton alone. I know I've heard a few stories about Calgary, but in Edmonton, the amount of coaches that go from team to team to team, the amount of players that switch from club to club to club, because these coaches are let go from one club and then they're hired by another, because there isn't like a system of accountability to actually allow athletes to talk about the abuse that they're experiencing, so that all of Edmonton soccer is aware that like this coach is like bad news. And so they just go on this parade of like ruining kids' lives and destroying clubs because no one is speaking up. And it is, now that you've mentioned it, way worse on the women's side than it is the men's side. I'm fired up today.
I know. I feel like this idea just came to our mind, and now we're like, oh my gosh. Yeah, because logically, you would see that, like the coaches bouncing around or players bouncing around. And logically, would you not look at that and be like, red flag, what's going on? What's going on? But that doesn't really happen.
No.
And I think we could get into all the different factors, but probably just not enough coaches. So people are probably just like, well, they're going to coach. So
that definitely is
whatever.
the case. Like and again, we're not coach haters. Like our episodes are not to be like every coach sucks and like so much abuse happens. Like, no, we've coached too. But you spend a ton of time as a coach making no monies and having expectations from everyone for you to be perfect. That can turn someone into a little bit of a sociopath over time. That type of isolated, siloed pressure of not being able to talk to anyone about the stress that you experience as a coach is either going to create a panic disorder for yourself, or you're going to have to develop such an intense ego that narcissism is your only way of moving through life without feeling the weight of all those expectations. That's why narcissism develops a whole lot, is because it is like the subconscious strategy of being sick and tired of dealing with constant emotional pain and disruption, that you sever your connection to your emotional self and you only think about your needs. You're in a constant state of fight or flight without actually feeling and noticing the distress that's happening beneath the surface. And a lot of coaches, unfortunately, are given the perfect parameters to become very narcissistic, because of being put on a pedestal and the ego and the expectations of having to be perfect. It's literally the perfect storm of developing that type of ego. I hope that was you could comprehend what I shared there, but that's why we're more passionate about helping coaches than we are athletes, because one good coach can make the difference for a kid who has a rough home life. And it's just that 1 year and can change that kid's life.
Yes. We are not coach haters. We are coach lovers. Yes, that's why we're so passionate about this. Let's move into isolation because, like you said, it's so closely connected to the coercion. So it's just like what it sounds like. You isolate players or whoever, employees, from other athletes, teammates, trainers, friends, access to training facilities. It could be whatever you think of. As a way to keep them accountable for their actions, or to just simply have some type of sense of control over them. Yeah.
And not to bring you back to where, you and I first started on this podcast, but that's kind of where your brain had to take you in your experience as a college athlete, was just feeling really isolated from your teammates and isolated from the feeling of being belonging and connected to the team. And, the irony of that is that, your coaching staff most likely thought that they were using strategies to bring out more in you and to increase your performance. But all it did was like send you in the opposite direction.
Yeah. And you worded that really well. I think that's maybe where the unintentional piece of it comes. Yeah. And again, maybe there's unintentional isolation as well of, hey, if we just like change how we treat this athlete, or we're a little bit harder on them, or take away other distractions, they'll focus a lot more and become a stronger athlete.
Yeah.
Most of the time, it does the opposite.
Totally. I mean, we have more than enough research in sport and performance psychology to support that a player's performance increases the more they know that they are supported and believed in by their family, by their teammates, by the coaching staff. These one-off like fear motivator techniques that are used globally throughout the season are destroying any potential that an athlete has, not just to like maybe make a career out of sport, but to take what sport taught them and to use it in an effective way in their careers after sport and their personal relationships. The amount of clients that we see where the disturbance and the stress that's occurring in their personal life is a direct result of unprocessed trauma from sports is wildly high. So it is a big thing when unintentional coercion and isolation is happening year over year without someone stepping in or supporting a coach and pointing out, hey, do you realize that like this is happening? Or maybe have you thought about a different way of approaching, performance and development with your team? But we as sports psychs are always on the brunt end of seeing these athletes be at their worst as a result of this.
Yeah. One day we'll be there before it happens.
Exactly.
We'll be in the preventative
That's
area.
the goal.
Yes. Some examples of isolation are like convincing the athlete that their friends and family don't know what's best for them, and the coach does, and then they isolate them in that way. It might look like choosing favorites. For example, having all the top 5, top 10 players versus the bottom 5, bottom 10 play against each other all the time. It just like creates these, like, athletes aren't stupid. You know usually where you stand-ish on a team.
Yeah.
And then when it's like pointed out, right? And then it leads to things like embarrassment and shame and everything like that. And yeah, just splitting up the players. And then another one, if players are injured or sick, like my example of having strep throat on a Monday, and I was not allowed to step foot on the court until the next Monday. Even though, if you know anything about viral, bacterial, whatever it is, the one you take antibiotics for, bacterial. Don't judge me. You are good 24 hours later.
Yeah.
So just little things like that too. I just did it. I just said little thing. It's not a little thing, but.
Right? Just stuck in our language. I can even think of years as a coach where certain players would get injured and it felt like a little bit of a relief because you didn't have to deal with them or the confusion of like how you're going to get everyone into the lineup, or so you kind of use that and abuse it a little bit longer than you should to like have what you want rather than focusing on the development of like all of your players and all of your team. Again, it's the nearsightedness of a lot of coaches of wanting success in the season and not planning for the reality that unless you have a God-given genetic, or not genetic, but generational talent, a year of players that are just so skilled that they win all the time, the team that wins in playoffs is the team that has all buy-in from every player. That's what happens in the playoffs at any level. Again, outside of exceptional teams who just that year was really good for drinking water in the town. But it is important that you are combining your high skill players with your low skill players, because even the high skill players can learn other things from your lower skilled players. You create a class system where the players that are in the bottom half of your lineup don't really see the motivation or don't have that drive to improve because they know they're in class 2. Your team's not going to do very well in playoffs if you have one injury to the top half of your lineup.
Yeah, exactly.
Not great coaching.
Exactly. In speaking with these two parts of the wheel, I did want to talk about this article that I read.
Ooh, do tell.
I know. It's called Emotional Abuse in Women's Athletics. Now, again, this is just what I found. I am sure there is research on male athletics as well, but it's about winning at all costs. We'll link it in the show notes for you all to look at it, but it pretty much just interviewed a bunch of female athletes, and then it shows little pie graphs of the majority of the responses. So maybe we can go through it just to give some examples.
Yeah, for sure.
So it breaks down different types of emotional abuse. The first one was physical behavior. So the question was throwing objects at players or demonstrating any form of violence. And the question was, my coach sometimes throws objects like clipboards, chairs, or equipment when they are frustrated. And it's pretty, 40% disagreed. That means that over half of athletes have had a coach throw something.
I.e. have a temper tantrum?
Correct.
Is that the language they use, or they don't call it a temper tantrum? Because that's what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have dared to the face, but I mean, yeah.
Almost 60%, eh?
Yeah, and then one of the quotes that I wanted to read was, could you imagine a boss that throws objects or publicly degrades workers for their sake of increasing productivity in the workplace?
Well, unfortunately, yes, but it is way more socially unacceptable for that to happen. Would not be okay, but it is just norm.
In sport.
It's norm.
In all?
In sport, yeah.
In sport, which is crazy. Yeah. I'm just like thinking, because it's first day of school, like imagine if I just walked into my classroom and threw stuff at kids.
How much did you want to, though?
No, I'm just kidding. I would never. They're so sweet, but they sometimes drive you crazy. The next one asked about verbal behaviors. So verbal behaviors include yelling, belittling, name calling, degrading comments, humiliation, scapegoating, rejecting, isolating, and threatening. So if you ever heard any of those words and you're like, I didn't know that was abuse in sports, now you do.
I actually have a very vivid memory about that. I think I've shared this one before, so whatever, but it fits perfectly to this example. In the gold medal game of the provincial finals, the last year I coached at the U16 AAA level, there was this moment that I just feel like all time stood still, and I'll never forget just the stark difference between our bench and the opposing team's bench. There was only like, I think 6 or 7 minutes left in the game. We were up 3 or 4-0, and it was really awkward. The reason why I looked over, because it was how awkward this moment was, is you could hear the opposing coach just screaming his head off, profanities and yelling at his team and pointing fingers and just losing his shit. And every single player, their heads were turned away from the coach and just like looking down the ice. And I remember it because our bench was looking at their bench, and it was like just this awkward silence during a gold medal provincial game of like our bench being like, holy crap, like that's brutal. And then their team just being totally checked out. And the checked out part is what I wanted to add to what you were saying, is that yelling works once in a while, right? Mm-hmm. It is a shock to the nervous system, and you're going to get the attention of your players if they're playing like dumbasses. If they're just like, they just need a reset, a jolt to the nervous system that totally works when used in the right time. But if you are always hitting them over the head with that hammer, they're going to be so checked out that any sign of you getting angry, their nervous system is going to be like, seen this before. I don't need to do anything.
Yeah. Or we're just getting yelled at. We're not actually like being belittled. It's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And like you said, I think of like parents or teachers. Like when I was a teacher, I rarely raised my voice. But when I did, the kids were like, oh, Miss Piper's serious.
Yeah.
Right? So.
Yeah. You need to use that as a secret weapon. You save that, because it is very effective, but only when it's used sparingly.
Yeah. And you're not yelling and degrading them. Yeah. We're not saying the one time you raise your voice, you're also degrading your players or your employees, whoever.
Yeah.
Your voice is raising.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like even a more specific example is like coaches will often call their players lazy if they had like a slow quarter or a slow first half. What do you want them to do instead? Be assertive? Be like, use imagery, like I want you to be like a wet blanket, like on the offense, like use your words. Don't call them lazy, because then they'll be like, oh, we're just lazy today.
Yeah.
And there's no chance that they see the potential of being able to not be lazy the rest of the game.
Yeah. I never, like, that's a perfect example. Like when I was playing, I did not associate that laziness with like me being below my zone. I never was able to connect those dots because it was just, you're being lazy or you're not, right? And like, yes, now when I look back, you're like, oh, like I was just not like elevated enough in a good way to perform.
Yeah.
So that's the whole other thing, but that's where we would come in. Yay. Okay, the next question was, my coach yells at players when frustrated or upset. Again, the percentage, I am blind. 70% agreed.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, that's gross.
I know. My coach belittles players through name calling, talking down to players, or being overly critical.
And the number is
60%.
wow.
You might be like, oh, it's lower than the other one. 60% of athletes get belittled or talked down to. My coach publicly humiliates players in front of the entire team. 60%.
Gross.
My coach has rejected an athlete or athletes on the team simply for not liking them as a person or for unknown reasons. 70%.
Whoa.
I'm doing math, by the way, and straining my eyes. That's why it takes me a second to give the number. My coach constantly threatens to take players' scholarship money or threatens to cut players. 50%.
Oh, God. Disgusting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I hope you are feeling what we're feeling in the silence of these numbers right now. This is a sample size, which means that in science and research, like they have gathered enough data that they can say on a more of a global or universal scale within either that sport or sports in general, that on average, 60 to 70% of coaches are using anger and or name calling, threatening techniques, coercive techniques. Okay, all of these are coercive techniques to try to improve the performance of the team. No, you're dysregulated and you're taking it out on your players.
Mm-hmm. But as you say that, as trying to maintain that performance or improve that performance, one of the quotes from one of the athletes interviewed, she made me feel stupid my entire college career. Although I was always a starter, she told me I sucked throughout my 4 years there. I completely lost confidence in myself and went into a depression. So also, as you're listening to this, it is not just like all these people reporting were bench warmers or never played. You see it right there. It's people, it's every position, every level, all of it. They're all feeling the same thing. And that going into a depression after just speaks to the lack of support that athletes have once they transition out of the sport.
Totally. So this conversation was so much fun that Lindsay and I decided that we need to continue it for another 30 minutes. So we're actually going to cut this episode short right here. And we're going to be doing part 2, which will come out next month. So if this was something you were really excited about as much as we were, if you can't tell by the sounds of our voices in this, we'll be doing a part 2 to this conversation to talk more about isolation and some of the stats that have been out talking about how players truly feel in those locker rooms.